as the recording starts, yeah, we'll start discussing. Okay. Huh. Okay. So, oh God, only 56 people. So it has declined even more, huh? Mm, okay. So if you guys remember, yesterday we said that the empirical observation was that in general, whenever you have two species competing, then their one species drives another to extinction. That was what people were in general observing. And then we said we did the Lotka-Volterra models, and we saw that the model is also predicting that 3 out of 4 scenarios you are going to get complete wiping out of one species by the other. So now the question was that what is it that is being said, real data, what is real data telling us? So for that, what I will do is I'll give you guys, as I said yesterday, it's a complicated scenario. And what I'll do is I'll start out by playing you guys a video. Okay. So just let me share the screen for the video. Okay, great. Can you see the screen, people?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Uh-oh.
Massive vines that blanket the southern United States, climbing as high as 100 feet as they uproot trees and swallow buildings. A ravenous snake that is capable of devouring an alligator. Rabbit populations that eat themselves into starvation. These aren't horror movie concepts, they're real stories. But how could such situations exist in nature? All three are examples of invasive species, organisms harmful not because of what they are, but where they happen to be. The kudzu vine, for example, had grown quietly in its native East Asia, eaten by various insects and dying off during the cold winters. But its fortunes changed when it was imported into the southeastern United States for porch decoration and cattle feed. Its planting was even subsidized by the government to fight soil erosion. With sunny fields, a mild climate, and no natural predators in its new home, the vine grew uncontrollably until it became known as the plant that ate the South. Meanwhile, in Florida's Everglades, Burmese pythons, thought to have been released by pet owners, are the cause of decreasing populations of organisms. They're successfully outcompeting top predators, such as the alligator and panther, causing a significant reduction in their food sources. They're not a problem in their native Asia because diseases, parasites, and predators help to control their population size. And in Australia, European rabbits eat so many plants that they wipe out the food supply for themselves and other herbivores. They're a pretty recent addition, intentionally introduced to the continent because one man enjoyed hunting them. Like the Burmese pythons, various factors in their native habitat keep their numbers in control. But in Australia, the lack of predators and a climate perfect for year-long reproduction allows their populations to skyrocket. So why does this keep happening? Most of the world's ecosystems are the result of millennia of co-evolution by organisms, adapting to their environment and each other until a stable balance is reached. Healthy ecosystems maintain this balance via limiting factors, environmental conditions that restrict the size or range of a species. These include things like natural geography and climate, food availability, and the presence or absence of predators. For example, plant growth depends on levels of sunlight and soil nutrients. The amount of edible plants affects the population of herbivores, which in turn impacts the carnivores that feed on them. And a healthy predator population keeps the herbivores from becoming too numerous and devouring all the plants. But even minor changes in one factor can upset this balance, and the sudden introduction of non-native organisms can be a pretty major change. A species that is evolved in a separate habitat will be susceptible to different limiting factors, different predators, different energy sources, and different climates. If the new habitat's limiting factors fail to restrict the species' growth, it will continue to multiply, outcompeting native organisms for resources and disrupting the entire ecosystem. Species are sometimes introduced into new habitats through natural factors like storms, ocean currents, or climate shifts. The majority of invasive species, though, are introduced by humans. Often this happens unintentionally, as when the zebra mussel was accidentally brought to Lake Erie by cargo ships. But as people migrate around the world, we have also deliberately brought our plants and animals along, rarely considering the consequences. But now that we're learning more about the effects of invasive species on ecosystems, many governments closely monitor the transport of plants and animals and ban the imports of certain organisms. But could the species with the most drastic environmental impact be a group of primates who emerged from Africa to cover most of the world? Are we an invasive species?
Okay, so the answer to that question about whether we are an invasive species or not is actually pretty obvious, although most people wouldn't like to think of it that way, but still. So anyway, back to the presentation. Okay, so yeah, this is what we just now talked about. This is the video. And this thing about invasive species, India has been one of the major sufferers in terms of invasive species. So for example, if you look at Lantana camera, which is actually pretty common not only on IISER Pune campus, it has now become very, very common all over India. So for example, if you now go to the jungles of Bihar and Chota Nagpur, Plateau, Jharkhand and all that, you will find that major tracts of the jungle have been taken over by Lantana camera. Similarly, you have this thing unfortunately named as the Congress grass, the weed which came with the wheat supplies that came from US during the time when we were food importers from that country. In 2018 and 2019, when there were these massive floods in Kerala, then some very disturbing news came that two fishes, I mean actually many more, but two major fishes in particular. This is what is known as Arapaima, and this is what is known as alligator gar. So these fishes are from America. One of them is from South America, the other is from North America. And as you can see, they are massive fishes. Okay, this one you can already see that it's large. It's 200, it can go up to 200 kilograms. This one you can actually get much larger varieties which can go up to 137 kilograms. The issue with both of them are that they are top animals, they're top predators, and there is nothing in the backwaters of Kerala which can actually control the population size of these two fishes. So it is expected that these two in particular are going to wipe out much of the fish fauna of Kerala in the coming years. And as you know, Kerala has a fairly diverse fish population. They are pretty strong in that, but looks like with these two guys coming in, that's very soon going to become a thing of the past. So one major problem that one has to face in the context of invasive species is doing something to control them. And controlling of invasive species is almost a field by itself, and unfortunately it is something which is very, very difficult to do. The primary reason for that is, as you saw, these things, once they take over the ecosystem, they are almost impossible to get out. And even if you end up somehow killing them, uh, by the time you do that, they have actually ended up wiping out much of your native flora or fauna. That is why the main thing that people have been doing is what they showed in that video, that is having strong quarantine measures in order to make sure that these things don't come in the first place. However, what do you do about things which are already there, and is there a way of somehow controlling them? So of late, the method that most people are finding most alluring is, instead of trying to kill them, try to use them. Okay, so for example, what I'm showing you over here, most of you would have recognized, this is the Eichhornia, also known as the water hyacinth. So this again is an invasive species. This was introduced to India for the sake of its rather beautiful flowers, but once it escaped from garden ponds to the natural ponds, it became a massive problem. So in I mean, this entire movement actually started in Africa. There was a lady in Nigeria, I think, who first had this brainwave, but then the brainwave was actually adopted even in India. So what you have are various cooperative agencies. So for example, there is this thing called Kottapuram Integrated Development Society, or KIDS, and this employs 300 women in this Paravur district of Kerala. And what they do is they actually harvest the water hyacinth and then make various objects out of it. Okay, they essentially dry the stem, and then from that stem they either make mats, or they make some kind of decorative papers, which are then used as handicraft papers, and so on and so forth. So looks like this way, making it into an economic product is what most people are thinking is as the best way of dealing with most invasive species. So for example, you remember they talked about mussels, in the context of US, zebra mussels had become an issue. So people have been trying to see if they can eat those mussels. Okay, or for example, even in the context of the locust, which were a one-time species but an invasive species nevertheless, people tried to see if they could take those and make some kind of fertilizer out of them. Okay, now locust kind of one-time stuff, you cannot really build a business around that, but for these other species you can, with some amount of ingenuity and the quintessential Indian jugaad, you can come up with some kind of model for economically exploiting them. Then that might be one answer for living or adapting to the invasive species. Anyway, so I'll not go deeper into that. Invasion biology is a legit subdiscipline of ecology, and there are several properties of invasive species which they share in common. I won't get into all those details. What I'll do is I'll give you guys these two links. One is about Asian carps, again in the waterways of North America. So as you can see, these things are so numerous that they actually come out of water and they jump into the air. And these are waterways in which you have boats traveling at rather high speeds, and many a times they end up causing injury to the passengers. Okay, it's that bad. So people tried to check these things in different ways. So in this particular case, they tried to do electric fencing, and looks like these guys have now figured out a way of going past even the electric fencing. And no idea how the hell they are doing that. So anyway, extremely interesting stuffs about the properties of invasive species. However, the case of all these major invasive species notwithstanding, if you look at nature, then lots of species which seem to have the same niche. Remember, the original statement of Gause was that species which have the same niche cannot coexist. But in nature, it looks like that there are lots of species which have a very similar niches, but they are seeming to coexist. So the big question in competition biology is how exactly is that happening? However, before we deal with that question, we need to take a slight digression and need to have some understanding about what do we mean by the word niche. Okay, so this is called niche or niche, whatever. As long as you see this spelling, you know what we are talking about. So do you guys have any idea of what is meant by a niche? People?
It's like the range of environmental parameters for which the species can survive. So, for example,
Good.
the temperature or the
Humidity,
rainfall, or
pH. Huh. Yeah, humidity, pH, or whatever. Huh. Fair enough. Anything else? Okay.
I would say another important factor is what they consume, what they feed on.
Huh. what
That is
what
could
we
also be
consume, what we feed on. Correct. Correct.
uh,
Yeah.
the,
Huh, bolo?
no, sir, that's all.
ठीक.
Yeah, like two species which
Yeah. So when they say that two species with the same niche cannot coexist, what exactly do they mean? Do they mean the resources or do they mean the conditions? Okay. Anyway, before we get to that, let's explore these two very different concepts that you talked about. Okay, one is in terms of what they eat and the other is in terms of environmental parameters. Okay, so the first one defines niche essentially as an n-dimensional hypervolume in which the species exists. Okay, so this is the first definition that somebody pointed out. So the idea here is like this. The idea here is that yeah. So can you guys see the whiteboard? People?
Yes, sir.
ठीक है. So suppose you take some environmental parameter. Say you take temperature. Okay. So on in this temperature range, suppose there is some minimum value below which the species cannot exist, some maximum value beyond which the species cannot exist. Okay. So for the one-dimensional case, you will find the species from this temperature here to this temperature here. Now suppose you add, say, another axis over here. Say you add, say, humidity. Okay. So this is 0 humidity. This is 100% humidity. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that the species can exist only from here to here. Okay, say here to here. So now on the temperature, humidity, two-dimensional space, what you are essentially enclosing is some kind of an area, okay, where the species can only be found within this square or rectangle, whatever we have drawn over here. It can be found only within the bounds of this thing, right? Now suppose, so this is the two-dimensional niche. Now suppose you add a third dimension, say pH, okay, then this two-dimensional thing will become a three-dimensional object. Now you keep on adding all other environmental conditions that you can think of, and for each one of them you figure out the range within which the species can exist. So if you do it for all n dimensions of environment that matter, then you essentially get a n-dimensional object, and this object is what they call the hypervolume. Okay, n-dimensional hypervolume, and this n-dimensional hypervolume of environmental parameter ranges is what you call the niche of the population. This is what the whoever was the first person who was talking about, this is what the first person was referring to. Okay. Now, this conceptualization of niche is due to this man called G.E. Hutchinson, who ended up saying that ecological niche is a quantitative description of the range of environmental conditions that allow a population to persist in some location. Okay, so if this basically translates into that n-dimensional hypervolume that I was talking about. However, very soon ecologists figure out that that definition is too restrictive, and that is when the second person's definition was what came about. And people thought of another kind of niche, what they called the resource utilization niche. And this definition is that it focuses entirely on what members of a species population in some locality actually do, and in particular how they end up using resources. So you are essentially what you eat, and this is due to these two people, Robert MacArthur and Richard Levins. So in terms of the resource utilization niche, the various axes that you typically use, they include the habitat. So for example, for microhabitat, so suppose you are in a canopy, then which area of, or which height of the canopy is used by a particular species. It can be in terms of the macro habitat. So for example, do species prefer to live in deserts, or do they live in forests, or do they live in marshy lands, and so on and so forth. In terms of food types, it typically refers to things like the size of the food, the hardness of the food, the texture, whether there are spines or not on the surface of the food, and so on. And you can also think of it in terms of time. Okay, what time is a particular species using for its activities, and this time you can think of on the scale of from day to day. So whether they are diurnal or nocturnal, whether they are active even within the day, whether they're active more towards the morning part or more towards the afternoon part, the dawn, dusk, and so on. Or you can think from on a yearly basis, you can think in terms of their seasonal activity, which season they are more active in. So you can see that these two conceptualizations of niche, they are very, very different from each other. They, at some intuitive level, they connect to each other in the sense that they talk about what is the range within which a species operates, but the range of the thing that they are talking about are very, very different kinds of things. And these are the two most used definitions of niche. There are other definitions of niche, and unfortunately there are few concepts that divide ecologists more than the concept of niche. And there are some ecologists who think that niche is purely of a heuristic value and it doesn't play any predictive part. So their saying is that if you just delete the concept of niche from ecological theory, nothing much is really going to happen. None of our major theories or even minor theories will take a hit. On the other hand, there are other people who believe that niche, the concept of niche, does have some very important role to play. It's not a merely heuristic thing. And these people try to come up with all kinds of models, etc., to show that, look, without the concept of niche, it will really matter. So this is very nicely encapsulated by this quote from this rather famous guy called N.G. Hairston, who said that ecology's love-hate relationship with the niche concept has been long and not especially pretty. So some years back, two guys, one of them was Peter Chesson, I forget the name of the second person. So they actually wrote a book on the niche theory, saying that we are trying to settle this debate once and for all. But I don't think the debate is anywhere close to being settled. Anyway, doesn't really matter. What we are going to do is we are going to just use the concept of niche as a heuristic concept. And again, going back to competition, we are going to try and ask that what are the ways in which organisms which seem to have the very similar niche, what are the ways they can still end up coexisting. So The very obvious answer to this question is that if, although it looks as if the niche are overlapping, the niche are similar, in reality there is some kind of a partitioning of the niche. So basically there is some zone, in whatever way you conceptualize niche, there is some zone in which one species occupies that and another zone which is occupied by another species, and such that their interspecific competition levels have gone down. Okay, so this can be thought of in terms of resource partitioning in 3 different ways, and we'll deal with each one of them. And there is another thing known as conditional niche differentiation, which is very intriguing. And in some sense, this conditional niche differentiation forms the basis of a very interesting theory in coevolutionary dynamics. We'll come to that also. Okay, so spatial niche separation. So again, back to Gauss's work. Remember, Gauss had done this experiment on Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum, and had ended up seeing that these two guys, when you put them in a mixed culture, one of them always drives, aurelia always drives caudatum to extinction. However, when he took the same caudatum and put it with a species called P. bursaria, to his surprise, he found that these two in a mixed culture can happily coexist. Okay. So what was going on? So he looked at the whole thing and figured out that between aurelia and caudatum, both of them were top feeders. Therefore, if you put them in a culture bottle, they will always feed on the top part, and therefore they would end up competing with each other. However, this bursaria, these guys, they are bottom feeders. So when you put them in a culture vessel, the two species, caudatum and bursaria, nicely separate out in space, and by separating out in space, they only eat their quote-unquote share of resource, the top part of the resource or the bottom part of the resource, and that's it. They thereby set their case accordingly, and therefore somehow they end up avoiding competing with each other because of the spatial separation. Okay, so that's one.
Sir,
example.
if you do this in a monolayer, then does one drive the other to extinction?
See, the problem is, how do you do it in a monolayer? For doing it in a monolayer, you have to do it on a surface. A Paramecium won't be able to live on a surface, no? You have to do it in some kind of a liquid culture, and in a liquid culture, you will end up having a layer.
So how will you check that it is the spatial separation which is giving you this? Can you mix it up at regular intervals, or can you do something to check that if you make that distinction disappear, then the competitive exclusion principle?
That's a good question. I don't know whether Gauss did this experiment or not. This is an essential experiment that you are talking about. How do you know that this is what is doing it? And mixing regularly seems to be the answer. Okay, if you basically mix it at say 2 hourly, 3 hourly interval, then you are right. Then all the resources will end up getting uniformly distributed, and once that ends up happening, then you will end up getting the competition. One of them should basically wipe out the other. But I have to see whether Gauss did this experiment or not. Okay.
Sir, when we are talking about resources present in the upper and lower layers of suppose of aqueous medium, what is the difference in the amount of the things that are available? I mean, what kinds of things are available in our top layers and what are not? What are available in bottom layers?
See, so far I know these are eating other smaller organisms. So if those smaller organisms, some of them are available on the surface and some of them are available towards the bottom part, then that itself will end up creating the kind of separation that we are talking about. So
then we can create some sort of a monoclonal culture of maybe only culture of caudatum and bursaria, and feed them those specific food items that are present in the upper and bottom layers, and check this. which type they are eating, which are the things that they are
No,
feeding
no,
on.
no, 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 no. That part is pretty obvious. Okay, see, for that you don't have to do all that stuff. You simply, sample from the top and you sample from the bottom, and you see where is it that the cordatum exists and where is it that the Berseria exists. Okay, so that is how they figured out that one of them is a top feeder, the other is a bottom feeder. That part is not a problem. What that whoever asked that question, what he was asking was that how do we know that it is this factor and nothing else? Okay.
Okay.
For
Okay.
doing that, you will have to destroy the spatial structuring in some way, and by destroying the spatial structuring, you have to show that now they are not able to coexist. And now the question is, how do you destroy the spatial structuring? And he said that we will have a monolayer, and I said you cannot have a monolayer because of how the biology is. So then the other way of destroying the spatial structure is basically,
Mixing the
shake it.
solutions. Mixing the solutions.
Exactly, shake it. Correct. Okay.
So this won't violate the R star rule though, right? Because there'll be different resources at the top and the bottom.
Yeah. R star rule may you need to have the same resource. Correct.
Okay, cool.
Acha. So this thing, you guys have already studied this in some context, is it? Connell's barnacles? Has it been taught in the class?
Only, I mean, I remember studying it in 12th bio, but I don't think all of them have done it.
Oh, they introduced Connell's experiment in 12th bio?
No, I think it's just like an example.
Yeah, a bit.
Yeah, little bit. Yeah.
Oh, I'm very, very pleasantly surprised. Okay, I'll have to check it where the hell they did it. Anyway, so given that everybody didn't have bio in class 12th, I'll quickly talk about this thing. Okay. So, okay, this one is slightly more complicated because what is the cause and what is the effect becomes very convoluted in this particular example, but it's a classic experiment, so I should talk about it. You guys know barnacles, right? What are barnacles? Oi. Okay, where have you heard about barnacles if you haven't studied it in class 12th?
Tintin.
Exactly.
SpongeBob SquarePants.
Blue barnacles, right?
Yeah.
So these are marine organisms. These are crustaceans basically. They are sessile organisms, which means that they remain stuck to some part of either a rock or a ship or something. So they are commercially a nuisance species because they typically end up attaching themselves to the hulls of ships, and when you have a lot of barnacles being attached to the hulls of the ships, they create a massive drag, and that drag ends up increasing the fuel consumption of ships, and also ends up reducing the speed with which they can move. So this is the major reason for which after a few voyages every ship has to dock and essentially go an equivalent of the overhauling. A major part of that overhauling is simply removing barnacles from the underside of the ship. Okay. Now these barnacles, although they themselves are sessile organisms, their larvae are actually motile. So when they reproduce, they just the eggs are laid and the larvae hatch outside. Then the larvae essentially float with water. They're very small larvae, and then they float and they reach various rock faces. And once they reach there, they attach themselves to the rock faces, and there they grow like what you are seeing. Now, on the rock faces of Scotland, this man called Joseph Connell, he found a very interesting pattern. He found that when the larvae came and settled, that was more or less random because this is passive dispersal. So the larvae don't really have a control over where they are settling. Everybody gets settled everywhere. However, when these larvae became adults, then after some time you find a very peculiar stratification. You find all or most organisms of a particular species called Balanus on the lower part of the cliff, and most organisms of another species called Thamallus on the upper part of the cliff. So when they started, they were mixed all over the place. After some time, this kind of a stratification ends up arising. So, and very interestingly, these guys, these Balanus, they only go up to a certain level, below which you don't find them. Okay. So they asked this question that why is it that the barnacles are getting separated like this? What's causing it? So if you guys have read about this experiment, then you should know how to answer that question. What experiment will you design?
Sir, can you clarify the question? Designed to check what?
Why this stratification? Why this spatial distribution? Remember, I said everybody is everywhere to begin with. So why is it that after some time you get this? So the first thing that they thought was that obviously this is because of competition, some kind of a competition. So the first thing they wanted to check was that is competition really happening? So whenever you have a question like this, the simple way of doing it is to do a removal experiment. So what they did was, in some parts, you guys can see my cursor, right? Okay, I'll just draw over here. So in some parts, what they did was they removed the Thamallus, and in other parts they removed the Balanus, and then they tried to see what's happening. So what they found was that when they remove the Thamallus, nothing really happens. The Balanus stays where it is. However, when they remove the Balanus, the Thamallus actually comes and it essentially takes over this entire thing, which essentially means that the Thamallus larvae which settle in this zone, they actually grow, because remember, these are sessile organisms, they can't move in that sense. Okay, so when the Thamallus is removed, nothing happens, but when the Balanus is removed, these guys are coming down. So they did a lot of other experiments, and they ended up showing that these Balanus, these are actually much larger in size, something that you can probably make out a bit from the diagram itself. So when these guys are growing from larva, these fellows, the Balanus, they grow faster and they end up completely uprooting the Thamallus, right? So that's how they end up outcompeting the Thamallus from this zone. However, very interestingly, the Thamallus, they are more resistant to desiccation than Balanus. So can you guys see these arrows over here? This brown arrow and a blue arrow.
Yes, sir.
So these arrows are indicating the water levels. So turns out that this is the zone up to which the water is there during the low tide, and this is the zone up to which the water goes during high tide. Okay. Now remember, these guys, they need to submerge in water for at least some time, because that's how they get their food. They are eating planktons, so they have these tentacle kind of things through which they keep on pushing water inside their mouth, and they have some kind of a filter. So they're filter feeders. They filter out those planktons. Now, if you don't give them any water at all, then all barnacles will die. However, these guys, since they are in this high tide zone, they end up getting water for some time of the day, which is enough for them to feed. And during the rest of the day, when there is no water, they are able to resist the desiccation. On the other hand, these guys, they are very poor in terms of desiccation resistance. So these guys cannot go in this area because of the fact that this area becomes dry for extended length of period each day, whereas these guys cannot come down simply because they are being outcompeted by these fellows, right? So this leads to, this is what I've talked over here. So this leads to a slight nuance in the context of the niche of a species. And that nuance is in terms of what is known as fundamental niche versus realized niche. Okay, have you guys heard these terms before? Fundamental versus realized niche.
Oh, yes, sir.
Yes. So what's the difference?
Fundamental is like a theoretical construct, like how much could it actually up? And when you add all the constraints due to like other species coexistence and stuff, then it fits into its realized.
Right. So fundamental is what the organism can do on its own in the absence of any constraints. Realized is what it actually ends up doing given all the constraints that it ends up facing. So the fundamental niche of Thamallus is actually from here to here, but because of the presence of Balanus, it is restricted to this area, which is its realized niche. On the other hand, the fundamental niche of Balanus is this entire area, and that it is able to exploit. It doesn't really care about whether the Thamallus exists or not. Okay? So this is Bolo.
So, one question about Balanus outcompeting
Thalamus.
Thalamus. Isn't that a case where it is able to outcompete it because of its R and not because of K? Because you said it grows faster, and that is why it replaces it.
I said that, and I realized that I have made a mistake. I'm not entirely sure it grows faster or not, because what I have read about Balanus outcompeting Thamallus is more about the size of the thing. So this thing is larger in size. It is more powerful. The musculature is more powerful. Therefore, what it can do is it can actually uproot this thing. So the all these barnacles, they are attached to the surface using some kind of proteins. It is able to just dislodge it. Okay. Now, whether that dislodging is happening due to increased R or not is a question. So when I said growth rate over there, I didn't mean R wala growth rate. I meant the developmental wala growth rate, which allows them to be bigger.
No, anyways, if I were to model this using the continuous model, I would have to use something like biomass. I can't use the number of individuals, right? So I could use that could be still my growth rate. Anyways, this seems like it's more alpha selection from what you're describing.
Yes.
Right? It's how one guy affects the other.
It is a competitive, exactly. It's a direct selection and competition. Okay. Cool. So
Okay.
that's the spatial separation.
Sir, is the fundamental niche and the realized niche much like our, initial growth rate and the realized growth rate kind of thing?
Yes. They are very analogous to each other.
Okay.
One is the real thing, and the other is what it can happen theoretical. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so then you have what is known as temporal niche separation. So okay, I have very little time, so I'll be a little quick about it. So these are two species of mice that you find in the deserts of Israel. They use the same habitat. They eat pretty much the same thing, and they are, reproductively speaking, they reproduce in same areas. So their seasonal niche are the same. However, interestingly, one of them is nocturnal, the other is diurnal. So people wondered if this is because of some kind of competition that is happening, that one of them has become the nocturnal, the other has become diurnal. So what they did was that this nocturnal species, they from certain areas, they just removed this species, and when they did that, then the diurnal species actually ended up becoming nocturnal. Now, if you guys know anything about diurnal versus nocturnal, you know that you need very different sensory systems for being active in day versus being active in night, right? And obviously, if we are talking about deserts, then the kind of temperatures that you have to withstand if you are a diurnal animal, and therefore corresponding adaptations, are very different from the kind of temperatures that you withstand if you are a nocturnal animal, and therefore are being exposed to much more of cold during the night. So in spite of all that, within a few years, these guys, they showed sufficient plasticity and hopefully some genetic component to become nocturnal, and which suggested that the only reason that these guys are diurnal is because of competition from these fellows who are more aggressive, the common spiny mouse. Okay. So that's about it as far as 45 minutes are concerned. When we come in the next class, we'll deal with 2 or 3 other ways by which niches can be separated. Okay.
Also,
Just give me one. Just give me 1 second. What I'll do is, yeah. So it's 45. So I'll stop presenting, and I will stop the recording. Soham, are you there? Soham Chandak? Soham?
yes, sir.
So
Yes,
this is going into your drive. So please
Okay.
shift the ownership to me.
Sure, sure. Yes,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.